Good evening and thanks so much for joining us. My name is Beth AQ, the audio producer at the Wheeler Centre. It is my great pleasure to be with you tonight to host the launch of the Wheeler Centre's 2020 Signal Boost program. To begin, I acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which I'm broadcasting to you from, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and extend that respect to the owners of the lands and waterways of which this broadcast reaches. I pay respects to elders past and present, and as well as First Nations people that are tuning in tonight, both across the country and internationally. Tonight we gather to celebrate listening, an act that has been practiced by First Nations people since time immemorial. We hope to acknowledge and honour this history during this evening's event. I think it's impossible to continue without acknowledging the current moment in which we're living, what has been a distressing time for so many people. It has also been a time for some to stretch out, to breathe, to have the opportunity, if we're lucky enough, to take time to reflect more than we usually do, to tune into ourselves and the people around us, to take stock, to take a moment, to really evaluate our understanding of the world and how we got here. Whether you're tuning into the radio, to podcasts, to the sounds of your neighbour's lawnmower, or to your local birds, our sonic landscape tells us so much about who we are and how we live. Tonight, as we celebrate the act of listening, we remember that deliberate listening is a crucial skill for audio makers, and often the seed for something essential. Before I introduce you to our wonderful guests, I am so pleased to tell you a little bit about the program. Piloted in 2019, Signal Boost is a Wheeler Centre initiative offering tailored mentorship, practical support and professional development for aspiring Australian podcasters. Recipients are paired with an experienced mentor, provided with equipment and access to software to help them realise their audio goals, and have the opportunity to attend a series of intensive workshops led by some of Australia's leading podcast and radio industry professionals. I'll tell you a little bit more about the program and how to apply after we hear from our guests. To celebrate the opening of the applications tonight, we'll be celebrating the craft of audio storytelling by hearing from some esteemed creators. We will dissect the magic act of making something out of nothing. We will listen and learn about why audio is such a powerful medium. This year, each applicant is asked to share a creative response to a theme, which we'll hear a little bit more about later. But to show us how it's done and to get you inspired, we have invited some of the best audio makers to share stories, pictures and audio samples interpreting the theme Float. Over the course of tonight, we will hear from makers across Australia and the UK, including our 3 judges for Signal Boost 2020, Helen Zaltzman, Daniel Browning and Jess O'Callaghan, and the 3 audio producers that we'll hear from as well, Elizabeth Kulas, Becky, Zhen, and 2019 Signal Boost participant Shih. It's my great pleasure to introduce award-winning host and producer of smart, funny podcasts like The Illusionist, Answer Me This, and Veronica Mars Investigations, Helen Zaltzman. She has performed her audio work on stages across the world, including here in Melbourne at the Wheeler Centre, and she's co-authored 2 toilet books. Helen, thank you so much for your time today.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So before we play your piece, did you have anything that you wanted to say to introduce it?
I make a show about language, so I was trying to find something interesting along those lines about the concept float. A scoop of ice cream in a glass of fizzy drink. Here in Britain, that's called a float. Which makes me think of turds, or drowned bodies swollen with water. In Australia, you call a fizzy drink ice cream a spider, which doesn't make me think of turds or drowned bodies, but does make me think of spiders. Why do we have to go and make a frothy combination of fizzy drink and ice cream into something unpleasant? Enjoy your treat while you're thinking of things you find in drains. Float. Spider. In the USA, they went their own way, as they often do linguistically. All black, brown cow, Rhinelander, high yellow, black and white. Burn it and let it swim. Frost one. Bottom.
So this is heaven, it really is true, and I'm so happy being here with you.
During the heyday of the institution that was the American soda fountain, the soda jerks serving at the soda fountains had a self-composed lexicon of nicknames for different combinations of soda and ice cream, or sandwiches, or eggs. A mere glass of water could be a tin roof, one on the house, an 81, or dog soup. The American soda fountains were like theme parks where the theme was zero nutritional value and the roller coaster was sitting on a stool at the bar, watching a clean-cut young man in a special cap pouring soda over syrup and flipping a scoop of ice cream into the air like Tom Cruise in Cocktail and shouting things that make your order sound like a code or a nonsense poem or a translation into the language of another, more playful, more fantastical, more imaginative world. And as these recognisable but incomprehensible words reverberated around the glass and chrome, you'd feel like a tourist in your own neighbourhood, familiar but foreign. But by the 1950s, the soda jerk slang was disappearing like sorbet down a drain. The soda jerks, who were in their ice cream flipping prime in the 1920s and 30s, had aged out, and one generation's slang often tastes rancid in the mouths of the next. And soda fountain managers didn't find it appetizing that their employees were shouting about orders of dog and maggot or graveyard stew. So thenceforth, a brown cow was just a root beer float. In the harsh light of day, an all black and a one in all the way looked at each other and realised they were both just chocolate soda with chocolate ice cream. And did they still taste as fun? I mean, don't get me wrong, ice cream in a fizzy drink is still a pretty fanciful thing to have, but a float doesn't fly. It just floats.
So tell us a little bit about the trailer that we just heard.
Well, I'd read an article a few months ago about the slang of the 1920s, 1930s soda jerkers, and I just thought it was kind of funny and intriguing, but it's also hard to find out loads about it. It wasn't a particularly popular area for in-depth linguistic study. So I read an academic paper from the 1930s about it, and it was saying, oh, well, it's already on the wane. So it's quite nice in a way not to have to plough through loads of books that have been written about a thing. But we didn't... Just trying to think, it feels like such an American thing as well, that in the 20s and 30s you'd go to a place that was kind of like a pub but for ice cream, and there would be a special vocabulary to it, and that would make it feel a lot more special than you just, oh, this is just some fizzy drink with some ice cream. You're like, oh, it's a tortoise and a hare or something like that. Or if you're ordering an egg and you're like, oh, Adam and Eve on toast rather than just egg. No, Adam and Eve on a raft. That's what they called 2 poached eggs on toast. Don't know how they come up with this stuff. It's like the bingo slang, I guess. It makes bingo seem a little bit more festive.
So I'm interested in the kind of journey from idea to the final product. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, I knew I wanted to have some sounds made out of fizzy drink sounds. So I recorded the sound of when you pour some fizzy drink onto ice cream and it goes and then it very suddenly drops off, which was interesting to me as an audio person. I thought it'd be more like and then, happenstance, my husband had made a song in, I think, 2018, which was where the music was mostly samples of like drink noises, like a can opening and some like spoon tinkles against a glass, so I used that as well because it seemed appropriate. But I was just interested in a way just to do this very short story because I don't think Australia had it, Britain didn't have it. Why do we have these names for ice cream and a fizzy drink that are different to the American ones? And then what happened to all of it? So I don't know if I answered all those questions, but it was interesting to try and consider those questions in 3 minutes.
When you spend so much of your work with podcasts like The Illusionist focused on language and words, how do you kind of think that impacts on the way that you respond to creative prompts like Float?
It's useful to have like a narrower channel to consider a creative prompt like that, because just thinking, infinity things I could cover is terrifying and overwhelming. I find that very creatively difficult. But if I'm thinking, okay, how do I combine this in a more narrow way? But I think that can produce some unexpected results, which is fun. I also don't feel like I have an enormous imagination, so I don't know what else I would have done if I hadn't read about this thing a few months ago. It's only tangentially relevant because it's not even called a float in Australia, is it?
I don't know. I don't think so. I think that, as you said, they're called splatters. But I think, I suppose that ability to think tangentially is so important to radio making and podcasting. And so, yes, I do think that you have an amazing imagination.
Thank you.
How do you kind of keep in mind the audience when you're making, and like how much do you think about them when you are kind of in the midst of creating something?
Oh, a lot, because I'm not creating this stuff for me, because I don't find making audio fun. So it's all for someone else. And therefore the primary thing is to respect their time, and so make it worth their while and make it not seem self-indulgent. So it's got to have some facts in it. It's got to have a few things that I think that would tweak their imagination a bit, or that they would think, oh, I didn't know that, or that was a funny turn of phrase. Just a little idiosyncratic, but also just to have as little in it as possible. I think my work doesn't necessarily sound minimalist, but that's always the intention, to try and remove as many things as possible, just to keep it clear, because audio, you can't have tangents, you can't really have footnotes. So with The Illusionist in particular, where I might have to explain the research method to find out how some particular word research was done, but that's not the point of the piece, but you still need to know. So it's like, how do you do that as swiftly as possible without just driving off the road, you know? So there's always that concern. And I never want to talk down to people by over-explaining things, but you also I want to make it accessible to every listener. So it's like, how do you include enough that anyone can understand it, but little enough that people don't feel like it's condescending?
Helen, I know that you used to run a meetup for podcasters in London. I'm interested in, I suppose, your experience working with emerging podcasters, and I suppose what your response to them is, or how you, I suppose, practice reassurance for people that are learning this craft.
I feel what I can do for people is just really give them permission to go ahead. I think a lot of people need that when they're embarking on a creative project, particularly one that they know might ruin their lives a bit, as podcasting can, because it's very time consuming. And a lot of people also just need the permission to speak and have their voice heard. That can be a really big mental leap. And also just to make them feel like they're not alone. If they've got a problem, someone else has probably had it. And podcasting is very solitary for the most part. So just trying to get them through that. And to be honest, people think starting's hard, but I think carrying on is a lot harder. Don't tell them, because it'll put them off.
I suppose just coming back to why we are here tonight, launching the 2020 Signal Boost program. So some people that are thinking of applying might be at the start of their audio journeys. What advice do you have for people that are looking to get into audio?
don't be put off or despondent if you don't like what you've made, because it can take quite a while to get over your loathing of your own voice, say, or just things that sounded great in your head sounding not so great in reality. And also there's the whole taste gap thing where the shows that you love are better than what you've made, but that's because they've got 20 years behind them and a huge team and a huge budget. But I think you also just need to get through that. You need to push through the pain barrier, which means I think you have to set yourself quite a strict schedule where you're just going to make stuff and then make a new thing and a new thing. I'm not someone who spends a long time perfecting a single piece because I don't have the time because I make 3 podcasts. But I think that's quite good because it means you have to go on to the next one and you learn by doing that rather than like, well, I'll just tweak this and then 8 years has gone by and it's still not done, you know? So force yourself to get things done and then do another one.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's great advice. Helen, thank you so much for your time tonight.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
I'm now excited to introduce Bunjalung journalist, radio producer, sound artist and writer Daniel Browning. He produces and presents Away, the Indigenous Art and Culture program on ABC Radio National, and has widely published as a freelance arts and culture writer. Daniel, thank you so much for joining me today.
No worries, Beth.
So before we get into your piece, did you have anything that you wanted to say to introduce it?
Not really. I think it kind of speaks for itself, but it's, essentially it's the prompt to float got me thinking about, the kind of global pandemic. It got me thinking about a whole range of things, but also this idea that we are a country that's, an island and girded by sea, and boats and ships and things that float are kind of things to consider when it comes to talking about or reckoning with our past. So that's where it would begin. Welcome to Discursive, where poetry and politics find a voice. My name's Daniel Browning. This is a piece called A Floating Mountain, and it came together in thinking about the 250th anniversary of the landing of James Cook and the crew of the Endeavour at Botany Bay, otherwise known as Kamei. So I want you to think about ships and floating, but also this idea of the pandemic, of the virus, of impending disaster, human disaster, are very much in the ether. Two ships, one made from white oak felled in the north of England in the 18th century. The other from canvas, floating on a bed of cushions, filled with hydrogen.
It's a terrific crash, ladies and gentlemen. The smoke and the flames now, and the flame is crashing to the ground, not quite to the mooring mast. All the humanity and all the fans are just screaming around it.
What if ships didn't float? Sudden arrival of an invader from another land, decimating populations, creating terror, forces the population to make enormous sacrifices and completely change how they live in order to survive. COVID-19 or Cook, 1770. That's a tweet from Anneliese van Diemen, who's the Deputy Chief Health Officer in Victoria. She's trying to manage the worst biological threat since the Spanish flu epidemic 100 years ago. And for blackfellas, she drew the obvious parallel between Cook's fateful journey 250 years ago and the invasion of this new strain of coronavirus. And what I'm going to do throughout this piece is quote from the journals of Cook and Banks. This is Cook. From what I have said of the natives of New Holland, they may appear to some to be the most wretched people upon earth. But, in reality, they are far more happier than we Europeans, being wholly unacquainted not only with the superfluous but the necessary conveniences so much sought after in Europe. They are happy in not knowing the use of them. They live in a tranquility which is not disturbed. Love that. Tweets are a bit like viruses. They float in the ether, in discursive space. Some sink and disappear. They're like wrecks or flotsam and jetsam broken on the vicious reef of public discourse. Unwanted opinions, like plastic straws choking the vital organs of the sea. Tweets seem to hang on skyhooks in the air, waiting for a like or a retweet. They want to go viral. So as the Endeavour hugging the coastline of eastern Australia in 1770, James Cook and Joseph Banks are tweeting in their journals. Not one of them was observed to stop and look towards us, but they trudged along to all appearance without the least emotion either of curiosity or surprise, though it is impossible they should not have seen the ship by a casual glance as they walked along the shore, and though she must, with respect to every other object they had yet seen, have been little less stupendous and unaccountable than a floating mountain with all its woods would have been to us. You know that show, Who Do You Think You Are? Instead of passionate, mud-spattered love letters from the battlefront, a lock of hair or a message in a bottle flung into the lake of an asylum, we'll have tweets and posts, IGTV streams or Vines and Snapchats and TikToks. They're our digital footprint. Traces of us, stored under fluorescent light on a server in a blinking mainframe that sometimes overheats somewhere in Nevada.
So, Daniel, when you were prompted with this idea float, how do you go about approaching that?
I guess the challenge is to think laterally and not literally, but there's a lot to be said about thinking literally. I mean, I think I went through a whole range of options, thinking about the kind of etymology of the word float, and also this idea of flotation being a kind of therapy, and thinking about maybe going into flotation therapy myself. But what really kind of triggered that piece was, given the situation that we're in, with this kind of idea of ether and what's in the air, and then those comments were made on Twitter about likening the pandemic to 1770. And it's the coincidence of those two things, the coincidence of the pandemic, this invasion of the coronavirus, and also what happened this time 250 years ago. And I've gone back to the passages that I quoted in the piece from the journals of Banks and of Cook, and a later edited version of Cook's journals by a man called Hawkesworth. I've gone back to those things repeatedly in my life, and I've written about the particular entries that we hear in that piece. And those particular entries, they're very specific. They're 2 days, the 15th and 16th of May 1770, when Cook, the Endeavour, passed my country, so far north coast of New South Wales. And along the way, Cook, he named Cape Byron, but of course it already had another name. And then he talks about Point Danger and Mount Warning. And I grew up, and my family's from that little fishing village there where Point Danger is. So these words are particularly relevant to me. And I think, we have to, when we're thinking about audio, and particularly the podcast form, think about what does this story mean to me? How am I a part of this story? Obviously, there are times when you take yourself out of the story, but I think some of the best podcasts are ones where we feel a sense of empathy, and not just empathy, where we identify completely with a subject.
Daniel, do you see discursive being, like, who do you see the audience as?
Well, I certainly would hope First Nations people, but I think there's also, we're talking about poetry and politics, and and First Nations. So there's three things there. There are people who might be interested in how poetry articulates a kind of a desire for human freedom. People who are interested in the form of poetry, and also people who are politically engaged, and obviously First Nations people. And then there's that kind of perfect soul that combines all three of those things. And I know those people. I know who those people are. But of course, you're thinking about how can this work. And I'm talking about the poems themselves and the kind of discursive essay around the meaning of the poem. How can that reach a wider audience? Not in order to convert people, but just this idea of discourse. If we don't keep having ideas, if we don't keep talking to each other, culture kind of stops. So we need to be constantly engaged with each other, and we need to be constantly listening. And as much as we might, agree or contend with the things that we hear, we need to kind of be engaged. I always fear that there's a kind of very superficial engagement with Indigenous culture and with Indigenous voices. And I think in poetry, you can kind of capture much more of, there's a thing in poetry that's like music. It's universal, and it speaks to a whole range of human desires and our emotions to feel rhythm, to feel meter, to feel. There's a lot going on there, and I think you just as with music, you can use poetry or any kind of rhyme, and poetry there's a very loose definition of poetry that I have, and that covers a whole range of kind of musical expressions as well, spoken word, rap, all those kinds of ways that people articulate what it is to be who they are, where they are today. So I think, there's a perfect ideal listener. But I hope that it could reach a whole range of people and make them think.
Daniel, when you create a weekly program like Away, I'm interested in what your experience is like of creating something that's outside of that regular form and composition that you work in week to week.
The program that I present, Away, it dedicates itself to what's happening. I can't just sit there and make stuff up. I have to be responsive to what's current and what people are saying, and reflect what I'm hearing and reflect what I think. And I have to facilitate other voices. So it's never about me. It's about kind of the open mic approach, is that you sit back and you listen. The greatest thing I have in my professional life is the privilege to be able to sit and listen. And I have listened to some incredible, prolific, profound, and extraordinary human beings in the course of my working life. So I'm about the listening, and I'm about amplifying those voices. So when someone says, here's an idea, go and make something about it, that's an extraordinary freedom. I'm pretty thankful for being able to do that, because I can't really do that in my everyday life. I mean, I could, but I'm not that important. I'm the least important person in any exchange, because I'm I'm locked in a conversation where I'm trying to get at their truth, and it's really, my whole career has been about absenting myself from the conversation, absenting myself from the dialogue, because I do believe that oftentimes as journalists and makers of audio, we tend to insert ourselves where there is no need. So I'm going completely against the grain here, making this piece which is so self-oriented. And I did feel I felt quite, self-obsessed in making this. And I didn't want to come across as like someone who is like that. But the prompt was to think about this and how you might make something that other people might be interested in hearing. And I do think there is a strong theme, a strong current in, not just in podcasts, but in the literary sphere, of these kind of autoethnographies of kind of a stylized memoir where people are talking about something that really affects them deeply. And I hope you get a sense of that in the audio that I've made, conforming as much as it does to the theme of Float, but also being about a whole range of other things that you may not hear.
Daniel, there are people that will be applying to the Signal Boost program that are probably at the very beginnings of their audio making journeys. What advice do you have for people that are interested in applying?
I think you have to, we're in a kind of time in history where, you know, the podcast form or audio is becoming is ever more widely subscribed to, and there are so many podcasts in production, there are so many podcasts already available. I think the idea is to kind of, you know, don't just find a point of difference, but find out, like, what are the voices, who are the people whose voices do I want to amplify other than my own? We have to always think about decenter the conversation, like what's limited about my experience, what are the experiences that I want to have, what are the experiences I want to engage listeners with. And it's always about kind of taking yourself out of the equation, and we have to stop thinking in terms of this kind of the bardic voice that me sitting in my living room and commentating on sport that's happening, like, you know, 10,000 kilometres away, and making jokes about it is inherently interesting or funny. We always have to work from the idea that actually what I have to contribute is not that interesting. I believe in it, but what can I do to make it better? How can I make this idea inherently listenable? And, you know, we have all these things that I never had to think about any of this when I started in journalism 26 years ago. There was no such thing as a podcast. There was radio. And I still don't entirely see the difference between radio and podcast. It's audio storytelling, and what we're doing is we're trying to engage listeners and to have a conversation and to stimulate, you know, public discourse, to contribute to culture. So this kind of false dichotomy between radio and podcast does annoy me. So just think about audio storytelling and be a good audio storyteller. But do think about, what are the voices here? Who are the people that need to be telling this story, other than, if it's not me, who is it? And how do I facilitate and amplify those voices?
I think that's excellent advice. Daniel, thank you so much for your time and for creating an incredible piece for this.
Thanks so much, Beth, and thanks for inviting me to be part of Signal Boost, and I wish everyone the best of luck in their journey to make good audio stories.
It's my great pleasure to introduce Jess O'Callaghan, Festival Manager and Podcast Producer at Audiocraft and Producer at Radio National Fictions. She has worked on news and documentary programs across commercial, community and public radio, as well as independent podcasts. Thanks so much for your time today, Jess.
Thanks for having me.
It is such a pleasure. Before we play your piece, did you want to say anything to introduce it?
Oh God, how to introduce it? All right, I guess I wanted to take the prompt and do something that was fictional, but also, kind of fun and creative. So that's where I went with it, and I hope it's not too weird.
Nan says they made a lot of jokes at first.
Sucks to have a harbourside mansion.
Who needs a pool now, Karen? Your whole backyard's a pool.
But of course, the rich just moved to higher ground.
The median price of a two-bedroom house in Katoomba hit a record high this month.
The city built upwards. You couldn't live on the bottom floors anymore. I don't remember any of this. Not really. Me? I've always lived on the float. Nan and I have always lived in the same lot. It used to be a boat. Gets a leak now and then, but I know how to stop them. It's definitely not the nicest part of the float, but it's not the shittest either. In the week, I work in the hydroponics lab. They say the lab ships used to travel the world with thousands of people on them, like for fun. But then there was a virus and everyone realised how stupid that was. So they just sat in the harbour for decades, rusting, until someone had the idea to start filling them up with tomatoes. No one born off the float could swim in the water. But my generation, we were born with immunity to all the junk in the harbour. So on Saturday nights, just after dark, we swim to the island. We crawl over the rocks. That's my trailer for a fictional podcast called The Float, where it's set in the future in my head, where like the grandparents in this era, sort of like millennial grandparents, but I don't know if that, we'll wait and see how bad things get, how quickly, but that's where it was in my head. And basically sea levels have risen so that the coastline and all of the nice waterfront properties in Sydney are uninhabitable, and all of the rich are moving to higher ground, and so all of the people who would usually sort of live in the inner west or in the west of Sydney are kind of pushed into the water and pushed into living in kind of these like shambolic floating houses, and sort of like a group of people who are all living on the water in old boats or things like that. And I kind of imagine that all these cruise ships are kind of like tied together. There's like, I was trying to think of what would be fun with sound, so trying to think about like a combo of kind of like technology, but also like old wooden floorboards and like creaks and so that's where they live. And they, I think that like there's something interesting in the generational divide that's going to happen between us and our grandkids. Like they're just going to be pissed as hell, I think, at how
how we've been living now when we think about what could happen. And so given like our generational divide that kind of happens at the moment, I really wanted to play with that in fiction. I'm always really interested to play with that in fiction, thinking about like how we're treating future generations as well as how like hard done by we feel by the treatment from previous generations to us. So I wanted to play with those things in fiction, and I mean it doesn't exist, it's just a trailer but it was really fun to kind of like flesh out what the story could be and like imagine what lives those people could live and what lives like the young people in that society could live, and because I think there's good things and bad things, like even when we're living under like really dire circumstances, all our lives are really complicated. So that's really fun to play with in fiction.
I love it. You've created such a full world. It's really incredible. I'm interested, when you first kind of received the prompt of Float, how do you kind of go about navigating that?
I think my problem with prompts is that I always get really fixated on the word. And so like you'll notice like I haven't gone to like the word is the title of the podcast, right? So like when I first got the prompt, I was like, oh, there's so many, this happens to me with all prompts. It's always like, there's so many cool ways I can interpret this, but all I ended up doing was putting a "the" in front of the word float. Like that's the name of the podcast. And it's just how I feel like I tried to get a friend of mine. I was like, do you reckon you can do like a cover of Modest Mouse, the Modest Mouse song Float on in like weird flute? And she was like, I don't think that'll work. But it's so literal, like I go straight for the word and I latch onto it and I'm like, oh, what are all the ways I can use this word? So I think that I think that's just, I've noticed that about myself and prompts in the past, but yeah, it really opens up, like it's not a story that I like want to tell without the prompt, so like I got the prompt and then I was like, what are some ways that I could use this to create like a fictional world, and what would the sound like, what would be fun to play with sound. And I guess like I knew that I would be limited by what I can currently collect. Like I knew that I kind of wanted, or what was on freesound.org, like I knew I couldn't be too wild in where I set this story. Like it was sort of Australian water and landscapes and creeks of boats. And so yeah, I think I like took the prompt and then just thought like, what's the most fun I can have with this in 3 minutes, and the world started to grow. But it's literally because of that prompt. It's not a world that I'd be thinking about. I was like, imagine if you just had to live on like a shitty float because of that prompt, I suppose.
You've kind of spoken about it when you said that you've been trawling through freesound.org, but like what resources did it take for you to create this world?
Well, so when I wrote it, I really thought, I was like, oh no, I'm going to have to be the voice of this, which I normally don't do, but I was like, it's 3 minutes, I'll be fine, I'll just do 2 minutes, I'll just read it myself even though I'm not an actor. And so I knew I was limited by the narrator, had to be kind of a young woman. She's younger than me, but like I had to try and make that work, I suppose, because I was limited in who I could rope into recording this for me. And yeah, used Freesound. Also just, I think it was mostly Freesound and Free Music Archive, sort of sound effects, and also just some stuff that I had on my computer, like water sounds and different like generic kind of stuff like that, like tapping, creaking and things. But most of it was found on Freesound. And I think like it's something I've been turning to a lot more since COVID-19, like just turning to these online databases for different sound effects that normally I might go out and collect myself. And it's actually been a bit fun. I was going to try and find some dialogue, because like what I really needed at the end was, I wanted a kind of like secretive party happening at the end that was maybe being broken up, and that was the hardest thing. I was trying to find like evoking that without getting like a room full of teenage actors. It was really hard. So I had a friend try and voice like drunk shushing, and she did a really good job, I think, but that was just her on her phone, roping in different friends to do those little bits of dialogue. My sister said it was the weirdest thing I'd asked of her yet, which is like saying something. But yeah, just I think I was sort of limited by the scope of what it was, and also my ability to go out and collect stuff. It would be really cool to be like, let's go on a boat and spend all day recording these sounds, but we've all had to get a bit more creative about stuff like that lately. So yeah, that's where I turn to for things like that.
sound design can be as much a driver of narration as voice can. Can you tell me a little bit about how you kind of navigate that tension between those two?
Yeah, I think there's something that I heard at which is like a women's podcasting festival, like almost 3 years ago now, which has stuck by me, and I use it all the time when I'm talking to new producers, which is dance with your tape. And I really think that like you shouldn't be like, they can hear everything that you can hear, and so trying not to step on the toes like you're having a waltz with your tape, trying to like move with it and dance with it instead of stepping on its toes is a really good way to think about it. So I try to not overdo, like, you know, I need to say that what you're hearing is that I'm on an old boat, because that's what the creaking is, but it's like playing with the limits of that. Like, how much do I need to go into where I am when they can also hear what I can hear? And so like I like to do this exercise where I have students kind of write to a soundscape, like just play the soundscape and write to it. And I think it's a good practice to get into, where you're fleshing out like what's happening to other senses, like what can you smell or taste or touch or see, rather than what can you hear, because sometimes when you're playing with sound, the instinct is to give more information about what we can hear. Like the rain was really heavy when there's rain, and I think that it's more fun to sort of tell us what you can smell when it's raining instead, because then it's like more of a whole world than just repeating what the sound's already doing. And it means you can do less narration, which in this case was really helpful because it was me acting. So the less the better.
Jess, I don't think I know anybody that listens as widely and thoroughly as you do. I'm interested in how important you think listening is in your audio making practice.
I mean, I don't think it's that important in a lot of, maybe it's not as important in other people's, but in mine, it's like, I feel like it's like where I get everything from. Like, I don't think, there are lots of things that I'm maybe not naturally, like I'm not naturally inclined to be, super artistic or there's lots of and so I really do, like, a lot of my learning does come from listening to other people's stuff and learn. And I know that that's true for a lot of people. I'm not sort of talking myself down, but that's been my whole entry into creating audio, is listening and loving other people's work. And so, and especially with fiction, I think that's like how I've come to love fiction and how I've come to work in fiction, I think, is through listening to really great audio fiction. So I think there are people who might not listen to quite as much, who don't have really long commutes and aren't listening to quite as much stuff, and are still really great audio producers. But for me, that's where I like draw all of my inspiration and all of my energy for this work from like listening to really cool stuff and then trying to work out what techniques they've used and how to put it together and how to apply it in my own work. So I think that like it's a really good way to learn skills and also just like get some creative energy happening.
Jess, I'm interested, as a judge of this year's Signal Boost applicants, you'll be listening to and reading a lot of pitches. What sorts of things do you think people need to do to stand out or to create a well-executed pitch?
To create an well-executed pitch, I think that something that stands out is when people have like a really clear idea of the story that they want to tell, even if they're not like 100% on how they're going to tell it yet, but when they've got a really clear, because that's the sort of thing that I think that the program itself really helps you work out, is the how to tell it. So I think having a really strong idea of what that story is or what the purpose is, the rest of it can come later. Like, I think a good exercise is trying to distill that purpose into a sentence that like you also like, that rings true to you, like that you don't, it's not that it's not what you're thinking people might want to hear, or that you're not thinking about it too much in terms of audience yet. It's just like the nut of what the idea is, and that's true to you in one sentence, and not kind of adding extra bits and making it more complicated, just being really clear about what that purpose is. I think that's like makes a good pitch stand out from other pitches, because I think that what the program does really well is support people in the how and how to get there. And I think too, having creative ideas about what something will sound like I think that listening to stuff that's come out of the previous year, like there are really, because people may not have already done sort of training in what audio or podcasting needs to sound like, I think there's really creative approaches to sound, and that really excites me. I think that what Pure Pop's done with this sort of like third space that their podcast exists in, just like, it makes me so excited. Like the idea that the whole podcast is taking place in this fictional ambulance is something that, I mean, that probably wasn't, I mean, I don't know if that was present in their original pitch, but the fact that that's sort of like that's a technique that I'm kind of pointing to now as like I want to be doing this in podcasts, you know what I mean? Like how, like what's the space that this podcast is taking place in? Like it's an interview show, but with this really clear sound and space, and I think that's really cool. So if there's any sort of like promise of that in the pitch, that'd be really exciting too. But I think having a really clear idea of your purpose is going to set you apart.
Jess, thank you so much for creating your audio trailer and for your time today.
No worries. Thanks for inviting me to make one. And I'm relieved I don't need to like sort out what happens next. It was really nice to make something that just sets up all the complications and doesn't need a resolution. So
I'm so thrilled to introduce Elizabeth Kulas. She is a Peabody Award-winning audio host and reporter. In 2019, she created and hosted 7am, a daily news podcast from Schwartz Media. Before that, Elizabeth lived in New York, where she worked for NPR's Planet Money and Gimlet Media's Reply All. Elizabeth, thank you so much for your time today.
My absolute pleasure.
In the early 1950s, at a government lab in Bethesda, Maryland, researchers began work on a series of experiments to map the workings of the human brain. The project was led by a brilliant young scientist named Dr. John Lilly. Lilly was fascinated by the brain. He was fascinated by what happened to the brain when it was deprived of stimulation. Lilly's answer was to create an early version of the flotation tank. Test subjects were fitted with breathing masks and a floating apparatus, and they were lowered into these huge vats. The water inside had been heated to match the body's temperature, so that floating there, they became effortlessly weightless, losing any sense of the boundary between their physical body and the outer world. The aim of Lilly's early research in this area was simple. He was interested in the potential for human mind control.
On orders from the Kremlin, Russia had launched one of history's most drastic political, moral and economic wars, a Cold War.
It was the 1950s. Cold War paranoia gripped the world, and fear of potential brainwashing by enemy forces became a serious concern.
America, it can't happen here. Well, this is what it looks like if it should.
And Lilly thought flotation could be the key. He wondered, if the brain was deprived of stimulation, could you then dictate what material was fed back into the brain in its place? In other words, could the brain be manipulated? Could individuals be made more suggestible? Could they be controlled? And then the 60s happened. And as the counterculture made its way across America, this brilliant young scientist threw off his Cold War ambitions. But he wasn't done with the flotation tank. He wasn't interested in engineering the mind for military reasons anymore. Instead, Lilly saw that the flotation tank was the perfect tool for exploring human consciousness. Now he wondered, by floating in the darkness, what inner avenues of our own minds could we gain access to? And soon enough, Lilly's work gained attention. And as his profile rose, his ambitions grew bigger, his fascinations became more eclectic. And frankly, things got a whole lot weirder. Lilly developed a fascination with the brains of other intelligent animals.
Come right out with the English, Peter.
And eventually created a government-funded project to teach English to dolphins.
1, 2, 3.
Next, NASA came calling, and Lilly was put in charge of developing an extraterrestrial communications program.
This is Houston, contact with a test. 1, 2.
And then came Lilly's deep interest in the transformative potential of psychedelics,
and of course, LSD 25, a derivative
which he'd eventually administer to human test subjects, to dolphins, and for most of the rest of his life, to himself. Passionate researcher, father of float, interstellar diplomat. Who was John Lilly? And how did he become one of the most ambitious scientists you've probably never heard of?
This is a scientist. This isn't some, nut that I brought out here. This man knows what he's maybe a little nutty, I don't know. But he's a real acknowledged scientist. Now roll this film and you're going to see some interesting things.
So, Elizabeth, I'm interested, once you have your concept for your idea, practically speaking, how did you go about making it?
That's a good question. I guess the challenge for me personally, and I'm sure for a lot of reporters, is always, when do you stop digging, gathering material, and when do you start actually kind of sketching out rough versions of your ideas and seeing if they stick together? And my instinct as a recovering perfectionist is always to keep gathering material and keep gathering material. But as I've moved through my career, I've really thought, like, I need to start creating something, early drafts, and kind of sketching out my ideas and saying them back to myself or my very patient, closest friends and family, to see where the gaps are, because that's kind of where you realise where the holes are kind of in your story, in the progression of your ideas, which bits aren't quite stitching together, how are you going to do that, are transitions working or are they not? In this case, there was sort of interesting challenges, like how do I bring tape into it? I did speak with one academic, but it was kind of off the record, so I didn't have a lot of my own tape to work with, and that would be different if I was reporting the story in full. But I also realised pretty early on that there was quite a lot of useful and rich archival material that avoided copyright and had quite a lot of richness to it. So I started pulling on that and spent quite a lot of time enjoying like archival recordings and just general messaging and video and audio from the 50s and 60s, and realised that was really going to be useful to me in making this little trailer. But mostly from there I started reading quite a lot and just kind of immersing myself in the general arc of this man's life and understanding how he fit in, how his work and his life kind of fit together, and I guess how his inventions have been really reinterpreted and in many ways have shared their original context, like the Cold War context and the kind of sinister military aspect of it. But mostly, I think it's a feedback loop between reading and taking in material, but then also quite regularly forcing yourself to start generating a script, putting down tracking, playing with recording your voice, and then seeing what fits together. There's not really a shortcut for that part. So I really quickly, like I think within a day or two, was recording versions of a script and starting to throw in tape and music and seeing what worked and what didn't. And then listening to that and giving myself gaps in time to step away from it as well so I could hear it with fresh ears.
I'm interested in how you find those limitations for your work and how you can kind of contain it in, for this brief as something that needed to be around 3 minutes?
I think I'm quite a visual person, so in this kind of practical part of the answer, but I kind of know what a 3 or 4 minute script looks like now, and so you start to get kind of, as the more stories you do, to get a sense of not only what that actually looks like on the page in terms of a written script or an improvised script, but also kind of how many clips you're likely to be able to fit in when you're biting off more than you can chew in terms of trying to hit too many beats in that time. And then the other happy thing that happens as you go through that development is you start to know when story ideas come to you, whether they're 20 minutes long or an hour long, or they're a multi-part series, or they're a 3-minute piece for a news radio, like a news program. So the limitations of sort of knowing how much to fit in, I'm honestly still refining in my practice and constantly realising I've bitten off more than I can chew, but I have gotten better over time at realising kind of how much I can fit in. But that fits very closely with the tension of how much do you take in before you start trying to create something. And over the years, again, I've really realised I need to jump in much sooner than I ever used to. Like, I need to start making almost as soon as I'm gathering information. So I've got a draft to keep fashioning. And that too helps you to realise kind of, oh gosh, that scene I thought was going to take 3 minutes is actually taking me 12 minutes. I need to rethink either where that fits and how long it takes, or how long this piece is, or whether there's room for as many beats as I thought. But it's just a practice thing, and I'm definitely still refining that habit.
When you're kind of working outside of that daily deadline, how do you go about finding stories?
To be honest, one of my favourite ways of finding story ideas, or one of the ways that I've found really useful, is I'm often reading something completely unrelated to my work, and I hear a mention or a segue in an existing long-form story or in a novel, and there's like a thread of an idea. And for some reason, even though the main story is happening over here and the thread drops off to the side, that's all I can keep thinking about. And usually that's a thread I go and pull on later and think about for a story. Other times with stories, I feel like it took me a while to figure out that the questions I had about the way that the world works or what's happening in society are totally valid. They're totally valid as a basis for a story that other people might want to listen to. For a long time, I just thought they were silly things that I was thinking about. And look, that still happens. But there are definite times where I think the question I have about how that story got to this place, or how we ended up in this place with a policy, or why don't we do things a better way if they do it like that in this country and we don't do it like that here, or they're questions that in many ways, I think if you've got the patience to sit with the discomfort of wondering if anyone else thinks like that for a minute, you can often find is fertile ground for good stories. Like, many people probably have the same questions. And then other things, I feel like experiences or connections or conversations that you might have with friends or contacts, they're things that they haven't necessarily thought about speaking to someone in the media about, but you realise, most people would be really interested in them. And I suppose in one way, I'm always wondering, is there a story I can tell through, say, even interacting with that person that no one else at the moment could think of or would know to tell? So I'm kind of looking all the time, to be honest, annoyingly, and quite inspiration. Like, it's quite inspiring to me to always be looking.
You've worked on shows both here in Australia and in the States. What keeps you excited about this medium?
To be honest, I fall in love with it sort of over and over again. Like, periodically I realise how much I love it all over again. And the other day, probably about 2 days ago, it happened for me again. I was driving back from the shops. I had the radio on, and I jumped into an episode of Radiolab about 3/4 of the way through, and an old colleague of mine who was on the show and telling the story that had come to him because, and he tells it this way, he was at the kitchen sink and his partner mentioned a story to him while he was doing the dishes, and he wondered, is it actually true? That unfurls into this kind of amazing story he tells by going to Russia. But I think the other thing that my time in the US working on sort of, I guess, shows that in some ways have become household names, which, is huge for podcasting in the last 10 years or so. It's really hard work, even for the people who are really, really brilliant at it. And so even though that can be kind of terrifying, and they're absolutely my idols, some of them, the other thing is that if it's difficult and you need to go back to the drawing board, I mean, people who have been doing this for 25 or 30 years and won every award imaginable will still tell you that every time they start a story, they have to start from the beginning. And as I say, that scares me sometimes and feels like a mountain you need to climb every time you go to tell a story, but it's also what's so exciting about it. Every time you do it, you can rethink what you're doing, and it's fresh and it's exciting, and it's okay to find it challenging. So I think, the power of drafting work and taking ages to refine it and just accepting that that's part of the process, and that your work doesn't have to be perfect, but it certainly benefits from being refined through drafting. They're things that comfort me in the messy middle of any project. But also, when I talk about that Radiolab episode that I heard the other day, I definitely had one of those moments where I didn't want to get out of the car. Like, I was home and I didn't want to jump out of the car. And it's a cliche, the driveway moment for audio makers, that someone wouldn't want to stop listening. But when you experience it, even though it's cliche, it's definitely true. And I love that someone's voice can do that to you, can stop you in the middle of your busy day, and you want to listen, you want to keep listening.
Yeah, absolutely. Elizabeth, people that are applying to Signal Boost this year are probably most likely going to be at the start of their audio journeys. What advice do you have for people that are starting out?
If you think that you would like to do this, please do it. Please come and join this community of people that does this for a living and for passion and for enjoyment. We absolutely welcome you with open arms. Please do it if you think it would be something that you'd like to do. You're right. I would just love to keep seeing the audio community in Australia keep growing, and lots of different voices and practitioners and people who come to it for all different reasons. Part of the reason that I love audio is that people come from all kinds of professional backgrounds and cultural backgrounds and at different ages, and they can find this thing and express themselves or find stories that people may not otherwise hear, the audience may not otherwise hear. And so I think the nice part about audio is it's kind of like an island of misfit toys. There's no good way to come into audio. There just is audio. I mean, I never thought this would be my career. I found it, in some ways, I felt quite late in life, even though now I see that was just ridiculous, because there is no too late. And there's all different ways to make a career out of it. Some people make 6 pieces their whole career and they're fantastic and brilliant, and they have other practices that feed into it. And others make 6 pieces a week because that's their job. So there's so many ways to do it. And I just hope that, I think what I saw in the US, because the size of the community is so big, is that there's just many ways to be a part of it. So if anybody was thinking about doing it, I just would love to hear that they follow that instinct.
Elizabeth, thank you so much for your great audio piece, and thanks for your time.
Thanks, Beth. It was so nice to chat to you.
I'm thrilled to introduce experimental pop and performance artist Becky Chen. Much of her work as a musician is interested in the intersections between human life and technology. Becky also works as a sound and music producer for Art Processes, a company that designs and develops visitor-centric experiences for art galleries, museums, and other cultural institutions. Becky, thank you so much for your time today.
This trailer contains references to drug use and bodily experiences that some people may find disturbing or upsetting.
Every night, same dream.
Have you ever had a dream that was so banal, so convincingly real, that you truly believe it happened?
Same dream.
Until it became...
the tide. It's always a tide.
Just like any other memory? Or woken up and perceived yourself to be outside of your own body.
Just like in waking life, except for the fact that I'm paralysed, and then there's this sense of impending doom.
Felt a part of your own body, as if it were not your own.
When I was in labour with my eldest 10 years ago, I was given some gas and air. I clearly remember my arm turning to rubber.
Or maybe it was just a day, like any other day, that took a turn.
We were sitting around talking, and they said, "Wow, man, this is really strong." And I could see they're starting to get wobbly. I really wasn't feeling anything yet, and they said, "I can't imagine how you're going to feel. We only had half each."
Maybe you lost a sense that you had a body at all.
When I lay down on the bed, my body felt super heavy, but as I sunk deeper and deeper into myself and away from the room that my body was in, this heavy feeling slowly transformed into a sensation of weightlessness, and I came to feel like I was floating. Not like floating on top of water where you're aware of the water and the air and your body floating on the separation between those mediums, but like floating in an endless void that was simultaneously everything and nothing.
This is Float, a trip into the mind and memory as we explore the experience of floating through consciousness and altered states. Each month, we dive into moments of acute sensory awareness, listen to musical interpretations, and we reflect on these observations, how they changed us, and what we can learn from them. Floating, the sensation of being carried by the substance of water or air, feeling weightless, feeling formless, feeling like one, feeling like, feeling in between states, a feeling that's often accompanied by fear or apprehension, sometimes scary, then a feeling that is chased. What is the line in between that awareness, and how can it help us to feel okay?
Every night, same dream.
I'll be asking my friends, strangers, and family about their experiences, comparing notes and exchanging tips on how we can cope with the negative or how we can revisit the positive in our daily lives. So join me each month for Float. You'll feel something.
Becky, can you tell us a little bit about how you went approaching the theme of float?
Yeah, this was a really interesting exercise, first to define what that word meant for me, beyond the obvious kind of literal meaning of the word float. And I think something I always do is try and tie things back, even if they seem kind of separate or slightly disconnected. I try and tie it back to my core kind of interests and passion. And I've been really interested in kind of the different states that we enter into, whether it's through sleeping or through grieving for someone, and when you kind of have that extra awareness of yourself. So I was thinking that as kind of as a starting point to describe a floating state. And I guess that coupled with thinking of what can be achieved in the podcast format, you know, there's a clear direction, given my interests in soundscape work and ambient music, to create a more of a like creative response to that theme. But I also love to hear personal stories from other people, and I love to connect with people through comparing our experiences. So I thought this would be a nice opportunity to kind of ask a few friends and like, I guess some musicians in my network to kind of respond and try and pick a moment. And within those, you know, like it was a text message and a few phone calls, I got such interesting and diverse responses. So that's a real starting point and a springboard to dive in and understand that there's possibly more within this thing to explore, and a podcast is a great opportunity to do that. So that was my approach, really thinking of it as it was something that I really wanted to create, and kind of taking it into like a mocking up what an episode might sound like before I could actually approach what the trailer might be.
Becky, you mentioned in the trailer that this could be extended to be a monthly kind of release. I'm interested how you came to that frequency.
Because of the conversations that I'd want to have, but then also delivering something, I was thinking maybe like 30 minutes would be achievable, or even a bit shorter, 28 minutes, so something a bit like achievable, but you can do with regularity. So not trying to be a full hour. I think that's like a bigger undertaking than maybe people might initially think with the amount of podcasts that are available, but it takes a lot to produce audio. So if it's going to be musical, it could be shorter, but maybe maximum like around the late 20 to 30 minute mark would definitely be the maximum. Monthly, I think it just gives some momentum to your process, and it's a nice time cycle to work in. And I could clearly see different themes that I was uncovering as I chatted to a few people, which was that could be explored in different episodes and revisited. Like, so maybe there's some kind of sleep paralysis trajectory, and then there's obviously like drug induced, whether from like pain management kind of drug induced, and other kind of stories possible there within other kind of processes our bodies go through, and in like a healing process, or managing pain. I thought that was quite interesting. There's like meditative states, and there's all these different kinds of areas that you could go into to respond to this. And then some of the ones were a bit broader. I had someone respond with like more of an existential moment that they had when they were kind of after some momentous things happened in their life, after grieving or something like that. So there was quite a range of themes, and I thought it would be nice to kind of circle back around to them and find a way to structure it in that way. So and also I a lot of the podcasts I listen to have like a monthly kind of schedule too, that the ones that have like stories particularly, and I think it's a good way to build an audience, having some kind of regularity and momentum, but then not overreaching.
as somebody that works in creating digital experiences, how do you think that your work in that kind of user design impacts the way that you create and think about your audience?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It has changed my process quite remarkably, I think, because I'm thinking all the time of the audience and the visitor. Whereas a visitor, I say visitor meaning like in a gallery space or a museum. Whereas, there are times in my musical kind of practice where I am purely creating for expression. I have something to say, or maybe I can't find the words, and then I find that through music. That's one way that kind of work seems to come out. But another is by this other kind of framework of hearing what needs to be said at this point, or what might benefit some people here, starting with a question and what might be nice to accompany that. And so, for example, in the gallery space, I'm thinking, all right, there's some artworks here and they have something to say, but how can I make people feel more connected and engaged with them? Or maybe I can add some music that's not so intrusive or distracting from the content of the artworks, but can kind of complement that. So with that kind of mindset, you kind of trying to just get people to feel comfortable, first of all, within whatever you're presenting, and using different things, whether that be music or sound design, and then narrative, to kind of keep people in a stream of your stream of, focus, whatever that is, your story, or if it's more sound based, then just keeping them on that kind of trajectory and engaged. So I think the way I produce these kinds of projects would be the same, like giving enough little bits and things to kind of for people to connect, but not limiting it too much, allowing there to be an openness and room for interpretation as well. I don't like to be too prescriptive in telling people what to think. Yeah.
How do you feel like that kind of work changes or affects the way that you think about audio as a means to engage an audience?
I think that what it made me think of was how for people that can hear and can enter those spaces comfortably, being able to use their full senses, it can be quite accessible, more accessible than relying on language or, a certain kind of language, whether that be like curatorial language in an art gallery context, or even like historical laden with a lot of facts and references that require a lot of pre-knowledge, or just kind of feel quite like a lot to take on. I think with music and sound, you can communicate a lot of these things quite quickly, and you don't need to use too many words. And with that means you can communicate across different native speaking audiences as well. So you might, music can reach a much broader demographic. So I think, and you can get a mood and tone out of, you can pick up a lot from listening for the mood and tone of what that music and sound is trying to convey. So I think what I learned was that it's an incredible tool, and it can serve a real functional purpose as well. And I like to sit on that boundary of like making like functional sound whilst also being creative with that. It's a nice kind of like limitation to respond to.
Yeah, I'm also interested in how having, I suppose maybe your primary arts practice is music, how you feel like that perhaps affects the way that you responded to this project.
Yeah, it's a good question. I guess I love making music for this kind of stuff. So I started with music, and I think I'll always start with a musical response. Even if I was just thinking, even if I didn't put any music in this, I would have still like needed some music to put me into a rhythm or a focus. So I would have potentially found something, and something that was already existing, and listen to that whilst I would try and make a script and write my response. So my first go-to is often a musical one, and that took discipline as well, because I have a lot of other interests in visual art and have studied graphic design and kind of dabbled in a lot of things because I feel, inspired to kind of reach out and try and draw or try and paint even, and that kind of, it's hard to like go, oh no, but I must stay on this one track. But in order to kind of get anywhere with music, I really had to dedicate more to that than other kind of creative pursuits. And since I have, it's like the more I do, the more it just expands for me, the possibilities of what you can do with music and sound, which is super exciting. And it seems to be a medium that always remains relevant, like no matter what's going on with technology, which is pretty interesting. That's the changes to cinema and other kinds of formats, and even how we kind of engage with stories. Like you can hear audiobooks and podcasts like this, like what we're talking about. But with music, it's kind of, no matter how you listen to it, the way it's created, and it kind of is a constant, I think, amongst this technological kind of evolving landscape. So it's my first point of call.
For other musicians that might be interested in getting into audio storytelling, might even be interested in applying for Signal Boost, what advice would you have?
I think my advice would be to not be afraid to put yourself into it. I think when I first started to try and make content, I was a bit too clinical, or trying to be like what I thought was more like a professional distance from the work. But when you're using your voice and you're trying to talk to people and connect, sometimes it's the best strength is your own kind of voice and what you think, and then let others respond. Then invite other people to respond, and that's how you'll kind of present different perspectives. There's a lot of musicians that I can think of that I, listening to their lyrics, if they're songwriters, I'm like, wow, I'm curious to hear more of what they have to say. So I think it would be an interesting series if there was, a commission for musicians to make these kinds of podcasts.
Becky, thank you so much for your time and for creating a great piece.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
I'm now excited to introduce Sydney-based science writer Ivy Shih. A former virus researcher, she now writes about all areas of science, from coconut cracking megabats to giant viruses. She's been widely published and was a participant in our very first year of Signal Boost in 2019. Thanks so much for your time, Ivy.
No worries, it's good to be here.
So, Ivy, before we jump into listening to your trailer, is there anything that you wanted to say to introduce it?
Yeah, sure. So when I first heard the word float, so float to me represented something that was quite directionless and quite formless, and combined with, I really like exploring science stories, but also the people driving it. So the trailer was me exploring a topic that kind of represented both. So something that was quite formless, directionless, but also encapsulate the really real impact of it.
Zhen is a marine scientist, and in her living room there's a kaleidoscope. It's beautiful. It's made out of carved timber, and around it is a brass casing that's shaped like coral. And when you look inside, there are bright bits of colour that tumble into patterns.
But then, of course, you lift it up to the light and hold it to your eye, and all these kind of sparks go off in your head, these light bulb moments, and you realize that the rainbow that you're looking at, all the different shapes and patterns, that's the plastic that I sent. If you shake it, I don't know if you can hear that, there's the sound of the plastic kind of rattling around inside of the casing. And this is a bit of a sad story, but that to me is particularly poignant, because one of the signals for me when I work with my birds of a bird that contains a really significant amount of plastic, before I even look or have to cut it open if the bird is dead or anything like that, I can tell right away that that animal contains a really significant amount of plastic. because if I push very gently on its lower abdomen, I can literally hear the plastic crunching and moving and shifting around inside of its stomach.
I'm Ivy Shih, a science writer, and this is Float, a podcast about marine plastics, following the trail of where they begin, where they end up, and all the lives they touch.
Ivy, can you tell us a little bit about the trailer that we just heard?
The trailer is about marine plastics, but the thing is about marine plastics is that people quite commonly know where it originates from, but what's not explored as much is about the really real impacts on the researchers that are on the front line that constantly study the consequences of it when marine plastics enter the ecosystem. And that's what I wanted to explore. And what I wanted to do as well is to explore the contrast. So the marine plastic kaleidoscope is really beautiful, but what it represents is something quite visceral as well to Zhen, the researcher, who to her represents something quite lovely, but also quite tragic because it has such a close personal connection to her. And that's what I wanted to kind of represent in this trailer, to get people to really be invested, to kind of be more interested with renewed interest and, I guess, investment into the topic of marine plastics.
Ivy, I know for this piece that you created some of the sound effects yourself. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. So generally with the sound effects, so Jen tried to represent the sound effect that didn't quite come through the audio, so I had to create it from scratch. So essentially I wanted to create something that was quite crisp, but also represented the plastics rattling around in the kaleidoscope. So what I did was I actually have a little box filled with bits of plastic folder ring binders that I just rotated really slowly in front of the microphone. I actually have it here. So this is essentially it. This is what I used. So yeah, and I think it was quite effective in creating that sort of entrance and opening for the trailer, and kind of used it again in the middle to create that recall.
Ivy, as someone that's at the kind of early stages in the first few years of your audio making journey, I'm interested in what got you interested in audio in the first place.
Yeah, sure. So working on audio had something I'd considered for a while, because I'm always really interested in different ways of representing stories and science stories with words. So the way I began is with science writing, and it's science writing, like text in itself is a wonderful way of representing emotion, and also really paint a really vivid picture. But gradually I discovered that there are certain stories that audio is able to represent in a very quite compelling and evocative way that words can't. So that's what I wanted to try and explore. And also listening to a lot of podcasts and also a lot of producers that and presenters that I really admire, seeing the really layered meaning to push through stories in a very kind of engaging way. That's how I that's what really ignited my interest in it.
And with writing as your primary arts practice, what has been your experience of kind of transitioning into the world of audio?
It's been really, really interesting, and I've been really loving it. It's taken me really out of my comfort zone, because with writing for audio, I guess when you're writing for text, being concise is very valuable, but in audio that's even more so. So less is definitely more. I've discovered in audio for writing. There's a lot of, you have to be short and punching, for lack of a better phrase. Just get straight to the point, and you can't just rely on words. It's multi-layered. You have to also think about the sound effects that you use, the soundtrack. It's all multi-layered into the whole product. whereas it's in writing it's more one-dimensional in comparison. So it had its own set of challenges as well. Also, what was quite interesting in working with audio is the way you interview people. Is that when you're interviewing people for writing, that you don't think about the ums and ahs, etc. That's not so much of a issue. Like, you just need to if you can get the answers you need to the questions you're seeking, that's fine. But for audio, you become really hypersensitive to your surroundings, and you dial up the current skills that you have as an interviewer to like 1,000, to try and make sure you get the cleanest audio possible, and also not just on the interviewer's side, but also on the researcher's side as well. So to get something that's quite concise from them as well. So it's been really, really good.
I'm sitting here nodding furiously because, yes, I can very much relate to that. Ivy, I'm interested, you were part of the inaugural program of Signal Boost last year. How was your experience of it? What did you learn?
It's been really, my experience in Signal Boost was fantastic, because, like I said, I'd been interested in working with audio for a while. However, I had no really set way of doing it. It was just a lot of kind of personal research online. I went to a few workshops, which was all really helpful. But Signal Boost really kind of formalized that learning process, and being able to get more of an insider's view of the audio production industry, getting really hands-on, really understanding what's required, a really kind of realistic sense of what's required and the processes. I'm hearing from a lot of amazing people. That's what I found really valuable. And also, it's not just a technical kind of support. It also provides you with resources you otherwise wouldn't be able to access when you're kind of going about it on your own. So that's what I found really great about Signal Boost, and really, really helpful, and what's been so great about the experience of it. And also talking with a lot of people who can share their experiences as well on how to make the best way to make audio work or not work, what not to do as well.
And as part of Signal Boost, each participant gets paired up with an industry mentor. What was your experience of that mentorship like?
It was really great. So Miles has been really helpful, especially in the beginning. Like, I was about to do my first recording and interview in the field. I was absolutely terrified because with audio, when recording interviews for writing, as long as the audio is audible, it's fine. When you're recording audio for a podcast, there's so much in my head. There was so much more at stake, because it's just one time. There's so much time commitment from the researcher or someone you're interviewing and yourself, and you need to think about Atmos. You need to think about getting clean audio. You need to think about, and also it was quite unfamiliar with the equipment, like having Miles just kind of patiently walk you through what's necessary and what's required. Was like, it really gave that sort of confidence as well to kind of go in and be confident about not just going in and recording, but also not being afraid to kind of explore different parts of audio and not being afraid to make mistakes as well. So that's been really, really great.
Ivy, thank you so much for your excellent trailer and for your time.
No worries, thanks.
The 2020 Signal Boost applications are now officially open. To tell you a little bit more about the program, in 2020, Signal Boost will provide 5 participants the opportunity for training, support and tailored mentorship. Participants will be provided with audio equipment and access to software to help them realise their audio goals, as well as invited to attend a series of intensive workshops, and will assist them with building a network of peers, gaining insight into the industry and accessing a range of professional opportunities. This program is designed to help people develop a voice and a craft before putting their work out into the world, and to encourage new, creative and thoughtful approaches to telling stories through sound. The program draws on our own experience here at the Wheeler Centre, as well as the experience of many talented radio and podcast producers working in Australia today. Signal Boost is just one part of our work in this field. If you're familiar with our events program, you may have joined us for public events with podcast producers from shows like This American Life, Serial, Ear Hustle, Reply All, Mystery Show, Song Exploder, Still Processing, and a bunch more. And in 2016, we co-founded the Australian Audio Guide to celebrate local listening. So if you're looking for somewhere else to find some more inspiration, it might be one for you to check out. Thank you so much to all of our wonderful guests for joining us for this special event. If you are interested in applying, all you need to do is fill out the application form via our website. You'll be asked to tell us a little bit more about yourself and to make a creative response to the theme, public. We hope that tonight's artists have got you inspired to create something. Thank you so much for joining us for the launch of the Wheeler Centre's 2020 Signal Boost program. Also, a massive thank you to the Ian Potter Foundation and LOM for supporting this program. You can find out more information on our website at wheelercentre.com/signalboost.
I now declare the 2020 Signal Boost program open.
And without further ado, I declare the Signal Boost applications for 2020 open.
Huzzah! What?
I now declare the 2020 Signal Boost applications open.
But now it's just half a ribbon.
That was extremely silly.
The 2020 Signal Boost applications are now open.
Visit wheelercentre.com for the best in books, writing and ideas from Melbourne, Australia and the world.